This story is dedicated to Prince Hatton, C.J. Woodman's Knot by Mary Danby. Read by Huw Carr. Sandra Morrison met Daniel Kahn at the Fun Fair, which came to Durringford every summer and filled the field behind the co-op with lights and shrieking and the smell of fried onions. She had just won herself a goldfish by throwing ping-pong balls into a goldfish bowl and was walking past the rifle range carrying the fish in a plastic, water-filled bag when he put down his rifle and stepped backwards, bumping into her and making her drop the goldfish. The water poured out of the bag. By the time he had picked up the stranded fish, pop-eyed and gasping in the palm of his hand, and carried it back to the stall for some water, it had died. He had tried to win her another, but failed.
"It doesn't matter," she said. "I didn't really want it anyway."
They walked through the fair together, and Sandra hoped people would think he was her boyfriend. He was extremely tall, at least 6'6", and he was broad too, a real hunk of a fellow, with curly blonde hair and a tanned outdoor skin. His face, if not handsome, was pleasant enough, with greenish-blue eyes, a solemn mouth and a wide, fairly short nose. She thought he must be about 26, quite old for her, really. Not that she was bothered by that. After all, at 17, she was hardly a child. "You here alone?" he asked, as they paused to watch the bumper cars.
"I'm meeting a friend,"
Sandra explained.
"from the hairdresser's where I work. But she doesn't seem to have turned up."
"Live around here?" Sandra nodded.
"Got a room down Eastham Street. My parents are abroad. Hong Kong, actually."
She never liked admitting that her mother had long since run away and left her, or that her father was serving a 10-year prison sentence, somewhere in Yorkshire, she believed. "Fancy a coffee?" asked Daniel. He smiled, showing regular white teeth. That night, he took her home to Eastham Street and surprised her by soberly shaking hands with her by the front gate. She felt a little disappointed, but honored too. He respected her. The next day, they met at the bus station, and he took her for a ride on the back of his motorcycle. He had brought a spare helmet for her, which showed thoughtfulness. Sandra heard the bike surge beneath her. Her heart surged with an unfamiliar, exciting emotion. She held him tightly, enjoying the feeling of his big, solid body encircled by her arms. She pressed her face against his broad back and thought she could be falling in love. During the next few weeks, they spent quite some time in each other's company. Daniel wasn't much of a talker, but she did manage to find out a few things about him. He had once been married when he was very young and had a little girl called Eleonora, Ellie, who lived with him and his sister Katrin. He seemed reluctant to say much about his marriage, but it seemed his wife had gone away. Probably she had run off with another, like Sandra's mother had done. Sandra hated her for that. Poor Daniel. How he, too, must have suffered. Daniel and his brothers, cousins and uncles worked together to make wooden furniture. They had their own business. "You never heard of Carn chairs?" he asked her. She hadn't. He lived in Woodman'S Knot, a few miles out of the town, with all the other members of his family. It sounded like some kind of commune. "I'll take you there, if you like," he said. The following Sunday he fetched her on his bike. She was wearing her best dress and had washed her straight, dark hair that morning so that it gleamed in the summer sun. "You're looking nice, then," he said politely. He wore light blue jeans with a wine-red, vest-like top. It showed off his well-muscled shoulders. Sandra thought he could probably squeeze her to death if he chose. She could think of worse ways to go. They left the main road and took a track that went through the middle of a dense forest. "Woodman's not," he told her, turning his head slightly. After a number of twists and bends, they reached a wide clearing. Sandra was surprised to find herself surrounded by at least 20 houses, except they weren't really houses. Some were large trailers, complete with steps and porches, and their own small gardens. Some were wooden sheds, some were made from concrete blocks, and there was an old Nissen hut which appeared to be the workshop, for there were a number of tables and chairs at different stages of construction, standing outside its open doors. From inside, she could hear sounds of woodworking, and round the back there seemed to be some kind of generator throbbing away. A large, plain-sided van stood under the trees. She climbed off the bike, and Daniel wheeled it into a corrugated iron shelter, leaving it alongside 2 other motorbikes, several bicycles, a pram, and an old black Austin saloon. Several people were coming out to see the stranger, and they smiled at Sandra from their doorsteps. Children stopped playing. The dogs came bounding forward. But Daniel took Sandra firmly by the arm and led her to the largest of the trailers. "First," he said, "you have to meet Aunt Marietta." Sandra had heard about Aunt Marietta. She was his great-grandfather's sister and was 106 years old. Sandra had never met anyone so old before. She expected to find someone frail and trembly, with papery skin and watery eyes, propped up on cushions, with a crocheted shawl around her shoulders. But Aunt Marietta was quite a shock. She had a wrinkled face, but she stood up straight and strong without using a stick, and the hand that took Sandra's was as firm as a young man's. "My dear," she said, and her voice was rich and rounded. "Welcome to WOODMAN'S. Welcome to our homestead." She had an accent that sounded slightly foreign. "Thank you, Miss Carr," said Sandra, almost curtsying. "You call me Aunt Marietta." It was a command. "I may not have a pretty face now, but at least I have a pretty name, eh?" She chuckled. "You know, Daniel has told me quite a lot about you. It is pleasing, yes. We are happy to accept you." She smiled kindly at Sandra's confused expression. "It's all right, my dear. We Carrs like to share each other's pleasures, and our little sadnesses too. So we don't choose for ourselves alone. We choose for all the Carrs. Now, Daniel will take you around and introduce you to the family. You will have tea with me at 4:30. "What did she mean?" asked Sandra, as they left the old lady's trailer. "All that about choosing?" "She dislikes us all to be friends," said Daniel, taking her arm again. "Don't mind her." The rest of the Carr family consisted of Daniel's father, Stephen, a genial, quiet giant of a man, whose eloquence was more in the strength of his huge arms than in his speech. His brothers, Nico and Ben, his warm-voiced sister, Katrin, his aunt, Greta, and uncles Hugo and Leo, his great-aunt Bella and great-uncle Julius, and numerous cousins, nephews, and nieces. They were all tall and well-built, a formidable team. And there was Daniel's daughter, Ellie, 6 years old, who stood in front of Sandra and looked up at her with unblinking blue eyes set like gemstones in her soft, freckled face.
"Are you going to marry my daddy?"
she asked unnervingly. Sandra gave an awkward little laugh, but Daniel came quickly to the rescue. He put an arm around Sandra's shoulders and said to Ellie, "Wait and see, little Miss Curious." Sandra's stomach seemed to lurch within her. Did this mean he might be considering her for his wife? Was that what Aunt Marietta had been talking about? She looked about her, at the warm, friendly faces of the Carns, happy together in their tight little community, working together, helping each other, sharing. She thought of her cold bedsit room in Eastham Street and the greasy fish cakes her landlady dished up 4 times a week. Her job at Hair Today, with Mr. Tony endlessly bossing her about. Most of all, though, she thought of Daniel Carn, of his tenderness, his strength, and how much she wanted him. For the whole of the following week, they didn't see each other. Daniel was away selling furniture, driving around the country with samples of their handcrafted pieces and taking order from shopkeepers. It was fine, strong furniture, as sturdy as the men who made it, and much in demand among those who were trying to bring to their homes a look of the farmhouse kitchen. The bestseller was the Carn Rocker, and Daniel collected a good number of orders for this graceful beechwood showpiece. "There's this new place in Birmingham, a furniture emporium, they call it. Wants 30 rockers, and that's just one order," Daniel told Sandra the following Saturday. They were sitting together in a small cafe drinking Coca-Cola out of cans. "That's nice." Sandra was so happy to see him again. Now she could ask him all the questions that had been gradually forming in her mind all week, as she shampooed and blow-dried and cleaned basins and swept up little piles of hair. "Daniel," she began. "If they can sell those, and I think they can, they'll be wanting more," he interrupted eagerly. "We'll be working round the clock." Sandra thought, "He won't be able to spare the time to see me. He's trying to tell me kindly." "Oh," she said. "Well." "So it seemed to me," he went on, taking her hand across the table, "you'd be better off coming to live at WOODMAN'S not." He was looking down. She couldn't see his eyes. What did he mean? "The thing is, girl, I'm hoping you might be wanting to marry me." Later on, she tried to remember how she felt when he proposed. All that came to her was a sensation of everything around her feeling insubstantial. The floor beneath her feet, the chair she was sitting on. Of course, she had said yes, and they had gone together to the jewelry shop in the market to buy a ring that was as like a diamond as anything she'd ever seen. "Where shall we get married?" she had asked. "St. Andrew's by the town hall, or the register office?" But she should have guessed. The Carns had a custom for weddings too. Daniel's uncle Hugo was to be the minister, having been born on Midsummer Night. For some reason, this gave him a special religious status in the family. And from the way Daniel spoke about it, Sandra could tell he thought Uncle Hugo a far more worthy person to conduct the ceremony than the Reverend Cumberside at St. Andrew's. And that was good enough for her. But she did worry about the legal side, the fact that Daniel had been married before, and she might lose her rights to a pension, and that her children would be born illegitimate. Daniel laughed at her. "You won't need to worry yourself about any of that," he said. "Just you trust me." So she did, and that night she went to bed late and, not drawing the curtains, lay looking out at the stars as she sang herself to sleep. There seemed no point in waiting. Sandra gave a week's notice to Mr. Tony and her landlady, neither of whom seemed too concerned about her leaving, and packed up her belongings in 2 suitcases. Before she went, she called in on her friend Ruth, a plump, plain girl of about 30, who rented a room in the same house. Ruth worked at the Durringford Public Library. She was quiet and reserved, but friendly too, and always ready to listen.
Good luck, Sandra, she said now. I'm glad you found a proper family to belong to.
She waved cheerfully out of the window when Daniel came to fetch Sandra in the old black Austin. On the way to Woodman's Knot, Sandra asked the question she'd been saving all week.
Daniel?
Yes, girl? He stretched out a hand and rested it on hers.
Daniel, why didn't Aunt Marietta marry? Or Catherine? Or your Aunt Greta? Your great-aunt Bella? Or any of them? Don't they like men?
He laughed a deep, comfortable laugh. Bless your heart, of course they do. They love 'em. He paused, smiling. At least, that's what they say.
Then why on earth?
It's an old family tradition. Khan girls never marry. Never have. But don't think they mind. It's the way of it, that's all.
Then Allie won't ever? And if we had a little girl?
She'd be a Khan, just like all the rest. There seemed nothing else Sandra could say. The tradition seemed a very strange one. It made her feel somehow uneasy. But she had to admit that none of the Khan women looked too unhappy with their lot. Perhaps they were fulfilled in other ways, like nuns.
Can I ask you something else?
Daniel took his hand off hers to change gear, then replaced it on the steering wheel. Fire away then, he said lightly. It was difficult trying to talk to him about his private life. Still, if they were going to be married, they ought to be able to be open with each other.
Allie's mother went away. You told me that. Did you love her?
There was silence for a few seconds. Yes, I loved her. Sandra almost wished she hadn't asked. She felt now in some kind of competition with the first wife.
Why did she go then? Please, Daniel, I don't want to pry, but you must see that I've got to know.
It was for the best, he said slowly. It's not easy to understand. It was what was right, see?
Not really.
Sandra bit her lip, trying to find the sense of it. She was about to ask him why none of his brother's wives were around, nor, come to think of it, any other married woman. But he had turned off into the wood now, and they were almost at the clearing. Abruptly, as if on impulse, he stopped the car and switched off the engine. Sandra, he said slowly, turning to her and putting an arm around her. You're marrying a Khan. We're a very old family, centuries old, and we've always done things our own way. There'll be things you wonder at and things that seem like they're just been put there to puzzle you. But don't you be bothered by any of it. You just be a good wife to me and a good mother when the time comes, and I'll take care of you. Right? It was a long speech for him. She sat quiet, feeling lost and lonely. All right, girl? He had both arms around her now, and suddenly he was kissing her, and his kisses were filled with longing and passion. Eventually, he drew away from her and restarted the engine. She relaxed back into her seat, smiling to herself. She was warm again, confident now. He wanted her. Everything would be all right. As they drove into the clearing, she was bold enough to ask, "Love me?" Daniel chuckled. "You bet." "Me too." And then they were engulfed by the family, who swept her away to Aunt Greta's caravan, where she was to live until her wedding in 2 days' time. The men stood on one side of the clearing, the women on the other. From her place behind old Aunt Marietta, Sandra could just see Uncle Hugo, bulky in a long, loose red garment, and beyond him the crowd of men. Somewhere behind them was Daniel, waiting to be led forward. Nervously, she stroked the white silk shift with its broad border of crimson roses, a Khan heirloom, they had told her. Completely covering her head was a fine muslin veil.
"Excited?"
whispered Katrin, a tall, reassuring presence at her side. She nodded and gulped a little, wondering if she could find the words she had so carefully practiced when the time came to speak them. Uncle Hugo's voice went on.
"For the flesh lusteth against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh. And on the day of days wilt there be the fulfillment of the word. Come forth for the joining, ye that will be joined."
Sandra felt hands pushing her and stumbled to the front of the crowd. Opposite her stood Daniel, also wearing a white silk shift, only his was undecorated. He looked very serious. They went together to stand before Uncle Hugo, who held up a large, ornately carved dagger on a black velvet cushion. Sandra glanced apprehensively at Daniel, but he squeezed her hand encouragingly.
"Daniel Khan, do you stand before me?"
asked Uncle Hugo in a deep voice.
"Before you all,"
said Daniel.
"Sandra Morrison, do you stand before me?"
"Before you all,"
she answered in a small voice, aware that everyone was listening with great care.
"Do you kiss the blade of the Khans? Do you sever thereby all ties outside the family? Do you swear to be true members of the family? Do you do part in death?"
We do.
Daniel and Sandra both kissed the dagger blade.
"Cleave then, one to the other, and be fruitful, so that the word may be fulfilled."
Sandra knew what the word was. It was the creed of the Khans, everything they believed in, Katrin had said. She and Daniel then recited together, "And our fruit shall find succor, and there will be life for generation unto generation, according to the word."
"Daniel, take thou Sandra. Sandra, take thou Daniel. The joining is done."
Solemnly, they turned to each other and, as was the proper custom, Daniel lifted the veil from her face and embraced her. It was all over. Sandra was now Mrs. Daniel Khan. Ali came running up with a posy of flowers, and people brought from their huts and trailers all manner of good food and drink for the wedding feast. It was a time of great happiness. That night, in the smart blue caravan that was to be their home, they lay together and talked for a while. He was Sandra's first proper lover. When the talking was over, he was more than she could ever have wished for. She was very happy at Woodman's Knot. While Daniel spent his days cutting down trees and taking his turn in the woodshop, Sandra learned her various duties, tending the kitchen garden, helping to look after the children, cooking, washing clothes in a big iron tub with a paddle you had to turn by hand, and keeping the caravan neat and pretty for Daniel when he came home to her each evening. Once a week, she and her sister-in-law, Katrin, were given a lift by one of the men into Durringford to buy supplies. She liked to do this. It made her feel she was still a little in touch with what she thought of as the real world. She hadn't watched television or listened to the radio since going to live in WOODMAN'S, nor had she read a newspaper. She lived in almost total isolation from outside news. But as the months went by, she found herself lulled deeper and deeper into the insular rhythm of the Khan community, until it was a struggle to remind herself that there had ever been anything else. And then she became pregnant. It was wonderful at first. Daniel was endearingly tender towards her, and proud that she was what he called bearing. Little Ellie fetched and carried for her, telling her she mustn't get tired. As she sat in her porch on the rocking chair Daniel had given her as a wedding present, cosily knitting baby clothes, Aunt Marietta would come and sit with her sometimes to keep her company. The old lady talked about the importance of good food and sleep, so that she would produce a healthy baby, a boy, Aunt Marietta was sure, a fine new Khan to carry on the family traditions. Once, Sandra had asked her what it was like to be a Khan woman, never marry or have children herself, and she had answered, in that rich, oddly accented voice,
"But we feel no loss, my dear. There are always children for us to care for. Yes, I think perhaps we are the lucky ones."
Katrin, who was a big-boned, handsome, demonstrative young woman, would have made an excellent mother, Sandra thought. She was very capable, and was a great help to Sandra, making little outfits for the baby, renovating an old pram, and painting the little rocker cot that Stephen Khan had made in the workshop for his new grandchild. There seemed such a lot to do. The baby would be born in June, according to Daniel's Aunt Greta, who was looking after Sandra during her pregnancy, and who would act as midwife when the time came for the pains, as Aunt Marietta put it. All through the winter they took good care of her, telling her to wrap up against the cold, escorting her across the clearing in case she should slip on some ice, bringing her tempting, nourishing meals, as if she were an invalid. When the first primroses appeared, she was as ready to cast off their attentions as she cast off their knitted shawls. Once or twice she tried to assert her independence, but she could see that it distressed them. They were so sure that they knew best. On one of their weekly trips to Durringford, that at least they still allowed her, Sandra and Katrin stopped at a tea shop for a snack. Apart from a few items to come from the supermarket, they had finished their shopping. They had a pleasant few minutes over their coffee and biscuits, and were about to leave when a girl in a red woolly hat came in and sat at the table next to them. She saw Sandra and gave a smile of recognition. Sandra smiled back.
"It's Ruth,"
she told Katrin.
"You know, the girl who had the room next to me in Eastham Street. Works at the library. Shall I ask her to join us?"
Katrin stood up.
"No,"
she said, fastening her coat.
"Don't do that. You go and sit with her for a bit while I go finish the shopping. It won't take me long."
Always so kind, always so helpful. Sandra sometimes sourly wondered how she'd ever managed life without Katrin. Ruth was pleased about the baby and wanted to know how Sandra was getting on at WOODMAN'S. Sandra had told her a little about the Khan family before she had left Eastham Street, and now she was able to paint a much fuller picture.
"It certainly sounds friendly there,"
said Ruth.
"Are you really happy then?" "Oh, yes,"
said Sandra.
"At least, I used to be. Not now?"
asked Ruth. Sandra turned the pepper pot round and round on the table.
It's the baby, she said after a while. Something to do with my baby. They won't treat me like a normal person. I mean, it's nice to be fussed over, but they're behaving as if I was going to give birth to the heir to the throne. They keep watching me. What about Daniel? Said Ruth. Does he fuss over you too? Sandra shook her head. That's just it, she said quietly. He used to. It was, well, just terrific. But now he's cooled off. Some men are like that when their wives are pregnant, you know. It'll be all right later. No, said Sandra, it isn't that. He says it's another of their funny traditions. He almost avoids me. We haven't been alone together for weeks. It's as if I were unclean somehow. She blinked as tears came into her eyes. He's moved out of our caravan, Ruth. His aunt is living with me now. She says it'll be that way right up to the weaning time. But I don't know if I can stand it much longer. Really, I don't. Ruth took her hand across the table. How long to go, then, till the baby's born? Sandra sniffed. 12 weeks. Well, then, not too bad. Another few months after that, and he'll come back to you. It's one of those things that has to be accepted when you're married into that sort of family. You can't change it. And you do love Daniel, don't you? Oh, yes. Then you have to learn to take him for what he is. I suppose so, said Sandra, blowing her nose. But they're a very peculiar family, Ruth. They really are. I mean, none of those Carr girls ever marry. And when the men find wives, they seem to go away after a while. I don't understand. I shouldn't try then, Ruth said comfortably. Just you get on and have that baby and leave them to deal with their silly customs. I dare say there's no harm in it at all. Oh, look, here's your friend. Sandra pushed back her chair. I must go, she said. Thanks, Ruth, for letting me tell you. She smiled staunchly. It's not too bad, really. I expect I probably exaggerate. Shall we meet again sometime? I don't know, said Sandra, looking over to where Katrin stood patiently in the doorway of the tea shop, laden with bags. It might be difficult. I come shopping every week, though, so perhaps we'll see each other. Take care, then, said Ruth. On the way home, Katrin positioned herself between Sandra and Daniel, who was driving the big van. Is she nice? Your friend from the library? Asked Katrin. You seem to be having a good chat. Yes, said Sandra. She's a very understanding sort of person. Without taking his eyes off the road, Daniel said,
Now then, girl, you've got enough people to be understanding at home without having to go gossiping to others.
I wasn't gossiping, objected Sandra. Katrin put a hand on her arm. Of course you weren't, she said soothingly. But I do think you ought to be resting more, not rushing about Durringford every week. You're looking quite tired. She is, isn't she, Daniel? Best to stay at home until the little one comes.
Suddenly, Sandra felt tired. She knew it was useless to try to overrule their wishes. They were so big, so powerful. All right, then. She'd do as they said, like a good little girl, and when it was all over, she and Daniel would be together again. One thing she was sure about, though. This first baby would be her last. Having decided to do it all their way, to be their puppet, she found the next few weeks quite enjoyable. True, she missed Daniel, the closeness they had once shared, but his obvious approval of her new acquiescence was a great deal better than his previous coolness. Although he was still careful not to touch her, he seemed more relaxed in her company, and even brought her presents sometimes. A bunch of primroses, a little doll he had carved. It represented motherhood, he told her, but she didn't like it very much. It had no face. He laughed and said that was because he wasn't much of a carver. When the pains came, Aunt Greta came to her caravan and brewed herbal tea, which Sandra was made to drink, even though it made her feel slightly sick. Katrin was by her bed holding her hand, but the other women were left outside. Now and then she thought she could hear them chanting in low voices, but the herbal tea made her head swim, and she couldn't understand what they were saying. She asked for Daniel, but Katrin said, "No, this is a time for women." And Aunt Greta said,
"Keep your mind on the pain, dear. Push it away."
At that moment, Aunt Marietta came into the caravan carrying a small basket. She smiled and nodded encouragingly at the sweating, moaning Sandra, then sat in the rocking chair, gazing attentively at the scene.
"Come along, Sandra, dear,"
said Aunt Greta.
"I believe I can see the little one's head."
As a final wave of pain came and went, Sandra opened her eyes to see Aunt Marietta bending down over the bed, sprinkling something out of the basket and muttering, "Roderick! Roderick Khan!"
"What?"
said Sandra, trying to sit up. Katrin put a hand on her shoulder and gently pushed her back to the pillow.
"It's all right,"
said Aunt Greta.
"Look, it's a boy you've given us."
She held up a red, wet, wrinkled creature, which immediately began to cry loudly.
"There,"
she said, handing the baby to Sandra.
"Take him. His name is Roderick."
"But," Sandra looked down at the tiny, screwed-up face. I wanted to call him Jason."
"I'm afraid it's too late, dear,"
said Aunt Greta.
"He has already been named."
Aunt Marietta, who was about to leave the caravan, paused and stirred the contents of her basket with her hand.
"Powdered woodruff,"
she explained.
"It's called blood cup hereabouts. We always use it for naming. Can you smell it, my dear? Like new mown hay, isn't it?" "Give me the baby, Sandra,"
said Katrin.
"You should have some rest now."
Roderick was a typical Khan. Strong, huge, healthy, and perfectly formed, with pale gold hair and his father's greeny blue eyes. He was very contented and lay happily in his pram outside the caravan, cooing up at the sky all day. Very often, Daniel could be seen wheeling him around the clearing, talking quietly to him and letting him clutch at his outstretched finger. Sandra adored him. He was everything to her, the core of her existence. When she held him to her breast, it was for her a kind of completion. He couldn't, of course, be to her what Daniel had been, but somehow that didn't matter so much now. Daniel was very kind to her, very attentive and solicitous, but she could tell he was more interested in the baby than her. Perhaps it was his defense against this custom of estrangement. Perhaps, when she stopped feeding the baby, he would be as ardent and loving as before. Meanwhile, all the women of the family were eager to help her look after Roderick, and she sat back and allowed herself to enjoy all the fuss they made of her. Motherhood seemed to be an especially honorable estate within the Khan family. October came, and it would soon be Daniel's birthday. Sandra had, by now, become used to letting the others do her shopping, but she wanted to buy something special for Daniel, something to show that her love had held firm through this time of trial, that indicated her readiness to welcome him back. She had been saving up the allowance he gave her, and there was enough to buy him a silver identity bracelet, something he said he had always wanted. She would have their initials engraved on it, his and hers, intertwined. Katrin insisted on accompanying her to Durringford to buy it, as if she needed a nanny, Sandra thought. While Katrin went to the ironmonger's for some paraffin, Sandra chose Daniel's present and gave an order for the engraving. With a few minutes to spare before she was due to meet Katrin, she wandered down the high street, inspecting the dresses in the shop windows, all the clothes she never seemed to buy nowadays. Most of her things were made by one of Daniel's cousins. They were very nice, but she did miss the fun of shopping. Outside Woolworth's, someone touched her arm. She turned.
Ruth!
The older girl smiled.
How are you, Sandra? I've been wondering. I've looked for you around town, but I haven't been in for a while. I've got my baby now. Roderick. That's a fancy name,
said Ruth. Sandra blushed slightly.
Yes, I know. But you're looking good,
Ruth went on.
Is everything all right now? Fine,
Sandra nodded.
Yes, it's all right.
Because it would be. Very soon. She knew it would.
Oh,
said Ruth, feeling in the pocket of her jacket.
There's something. Perhaps I shouldn't now, but...
She found a piece of paper, folded into a little square.
I saw it in an encyclopedia, copied it out. I've had it in my pocket for ages, thinking I might see you. Months ago it was. Someone rang up the library to ask when Carnegie Hall was built, and when I looked it up, well, on the same page there was this. I don't think it means anything at all, a bit of a joke now, but I thought there might once have been some link. Maybe I shouldn't give it to you, though. I don't want you all upset over nothing.
Sandra laughed and snatched the paper from her hand.
I'll never know till I read it, will I?
Ruth shrugged.
Look, I'm late,
she said.
I have to go. Promise me you won't take it too seriously. Promise.
Her friend hurried off. Sandra turned away and went to stand in the entrance of a shop, where she read the tidily written paragraph on the piece of paper. Carneads was the heading. A nomadic European tribe, she read, which, in the belief that it could create a race of great physical strength, weaned its children on their mother's flesh. Their way of life took on a religious significance and included the practice of celibacy in females born to the tribe. After a number of notorious murder trials in the 18th century, including that of Giulio Carne, sentenced to death in Zurich in 1756 for the murder of 4 young women, the tribe appears to have dissipated and died out. The name Carnead presumably derives from a number of European words meaning flesh. She dropped the piece of paper and stood absolutely still for a moment. Then her hands began to tremble, and she thrust them into her pockets. The encyclopedia was wrong. The day of the Carneads was not over. They lived on in Woodman's Knot, she was sure. This was no overworking of her imagination. It all fitted so horribly well.
Are you coming?
She heard a car horn. The old black Austin had pulled up a few yards away, and Katrin was calling to her. Nico Khan was at the wheel.
Yes, coming.
She climbed in the back and pulled her arms around herself, hugging. Smile. Act normally. Did you get what you wanted?
Oh, yes, thank you. Did you?
Keep going. Don't show fear. Tonight, after dark, put Roderick in his pram and run. Run into the woods, away, anywhere. Tell someone. The police! How long till the baby would be weaned? She didn't know. She'd left that to them. Soon, though, surely. Her milk was barely enough for him now. Tonight, then. Perhaps without the pram. Perhaps she would just carry him. Quicker, quieter. Please, God, he won't make a noise. She shied away from thinking about details, but her mind kept dragging her back. How did they do it? How could you feed a tiny baby on flesh? Mince it and boil it? Make a nourishing soup? Was that what became of Daniel's first wife, when Allie was a baby? All the other wives? Was that how the body she so adored, the strong, firm muscles that had held her so lovingly, were once nourished? She felt sick. "Could you open a window?" she asked. Katrin turned round, concerned. "Feeling bad?" she asked. "Oh dear, that won't do." How could they keep the flesh for long enough? Did they freeze it? Dry it? Smoke it? Pickle it in brine? "Drive more slowly, Nico," said Katrin. "She's gone quite pale." When they reached Woodman's Knot, Sandra walked unsteadily to the caravan and up the steps. Inside, she could hear Aunt Greta crooning to the baby, trying to control the hate and trepidation she knew must show in her face. She opened the door. "Oh!" Her eyes opened wide. "What are you doing?" Aunt Greta looked up and smiled. "Why, feeding our baby, of course." "He doesn't have a bottle, Aunt Greta," protested Sandra. "He's my baby and I feed him. Here, give him to me." The panic arose in her. She couldn't still it. "Hello, girl." It was Daniel's voice. He stood behind her, filling the doorway with his big, handsome body, filling her mind with terror and loathing. He stepped forward, put his hands on her rigid shoulders, and kissed her quickly on the mouth. Then he was gone, and his place was taken by his two brothers, Nico and Ben. As Sandra stood shaking, powerless with fear, they each grasped one of her arms and took her to stand in front of her baby. "Roderick," she whimpered. Then one of them put his huge rough hand over her mouth. It smelled of linseed oil. She struggled and kicked out at them, but they held her fast. Then Aunt Marietta came, and Sandra knew that the fight was over. "Drink this," said Aunt Marietta, holding up a beaker of something pale and pungent. "And there will be no fear of what is to come. Do it for Roderick Khan, for your fine, strong boy." Sandra drank and was glad of the two men supporting her, or she would have fallen to the floor. Aunt Marietta began one of her vaguely biblical chants about the spirit and the flesh and the blood that shall flow from generation unto generation according to the word, and Sandra saw without emotion the gleam of a knife blade among the folds of her skirt, and watched as Aunt Marietta made circles with it in the air before her face. It was the dagger she had kissed on her wedding day. And when the moment came, and the dagger descended, the baby turned irritably from his bottle and began to cry.
"Ah, bless the hungry little fellow," said Aunt Greta, rocking him. "He wants his mother."